Hi, welcome to TFiR's Let's Talk. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartia, and my next guest is Austin Parker, Principal Developer Advocate at Lightstep. Austin, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We regularly cover Lightstep, but just to refresh memories of our audience, can you quickly tell us a bit about the company?
Sure. Lightstep is an observability platform built on a lot of open source technology like OpenTelemetry to make it easier for you to understand what's going on in your systems. You hear a lot about monitoring versus observability, and we really try to cut through all that and give you smarter monitoring. Let you see what's going on in your system, help you understand it, give you better, more actionable alerts, and understand what's changed in your system.
What is the importance of observability, not just from the point of view of moving fast, but security and holistic approach to your stack, that you should know what you're running and how it's running?
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of words written about, where does observability fit in terms of the idea of, DevOps or DevSecOps and shifting left, right? My real argument is you don't really have DevOps without observability. You don't have DevSecOps without observability. You don't have continuous integration and continuous delivery without observability. Unless you know what's going on in your system, you don't have a lot. And how can you say, how can you have security and how can you have continuous vulnerability scanning or, inspection of what's going on in your containers without having some way to sort of holistically understand your entire system? I think observability is really the linchpin for a lot of these technologies and practices that we're talking about. And we should maybe change how we think a bit. Instead of saying observability is this sort of day two thing that you come in later and you add it in once you have a problem, start thinking about how we can design our systems with observability as a base layer that is underpinning, our security work, our reliability work, our chaos engineering work, our continuous integration work, right?
So when we do talk about bringing it as a foundation, of course there are technologies, a lot of open source technology that you work with, but it's also about cultural change. Of course, you mentioned we talk about DevSecOps, we talk about SREs these days, we talk about GitHub. So how much cultural change is also happening or needed? What are you seeing is already happening in this ecosystem?
I mean, you said it yourself. Observability is a cultural movement in the same way that DevOps was a cultural movement, right? And the same way that Agile was a cultural movement, in the same way that a lot of things are cultural. SRE is a cultural movement. I wrote about this in my blog a while ago, where SRE is kind of the refuge of a lot of people that saw Agile get taken and commercialized and turned into a product rather than a way of working and a way of organizing teams. And I think you maybe are seeing a little bit of that with DevOps more generally, but also with cultural movements of reliability, right? And observability. So there's a lot of different, competing products and solutions right now. Some are open source, some are free. And I mean, I work for Lightstep. I'm obviously biased, but what I would rather see is people look, at the end of the day, if you use my product or not, great. What's important is that you start thinking about observability as a cultural tool, as a way of thinking about performance, as a way of communicating performance. I think this is why I like to talk about SLOs, because the best thing about SLOs isn't the SLO. It's not doing the math to come up with this, right? It's being able to say, okay, executives, managers, PMs, customer service, everyone that's involved, everyone that's touching the software, what actually matters to us, and how do we talk about that across the entire company? How do we talk about that across the entire engineering, the business side of things? How are we all focused on the same end goal, and how are we all going in the same direction? SLOs are a tool that you can use to do that, but that's a cultural thing, not a technological thing.
Do you see some positive changes that are already happening, or still there's a lot of need for education and awareness around it? What do you see in the ecosystem?
I think there are changes that are happening that are positive towards that, right? I think you're seeing more of a focus on collaboration and communication. That's not necessarily in the observability space per se, but it's very close. Things like service catalogs. There's a really smart new project added to called Backstage, I believe, from Spotify. And the idea is, hey, how do we make it easier for other people on our team and other teams to know where to find data? Where do you go to find that dashboard or that run book, right? And by focusing on those sort of collaborative elements and focusing on building platforms that let you pull in all these disparate sources of data and correlate things, then that's going to get you a better result. I think you also see this in observability frameworks and projects that are being developed in the open source community, things like OpenTelemetry. So previously, one of the big problems with observability is I might have, I have all these different proprietary or commercial formats for my data. With OpenTelemetry, I can put everything into kind of a common carrier and translate from, maybe some existing legacy observability data I have, something that works with my new greenfield applications, and something that will let me convert from, other types of event data into a common, well-understood format, right? Like I was talking earlier, you could take your analytic data, your user analytics, and then turn those into OpenTelemetry metrics, and now that can go into the same platform that's keeping track of your SQL performance, letting you really accurately make correlations between these two disparate siloed sources of data. And that's the kind of collaboration, or that unlocks a lot in terms of collaboration, right? So it's not just a one thing or the other. It's not like a scale where you've got culture over here and you've got tools over here. It's more of a ladder where every new rung, where as you're building as you go, and you're adding, collaboration where you need to, you're adding cultural changes and, better ways to think about this, communicate about this. Then you're adding some tooling, then you're adding some more standards work, and so on and so forth. And as we build that ladder together, we're all going to get to a better place.
No, you're right about it. Since you already mentioned open telemetry, and there are a couple of themes that you touched upon, and I wanted to discuss, of course, open source is there, collaboration you mentioned. Open telemetry is a kind of merger of two other open source projects. One was open tracing and was open census. Talk about the state of open telemetry today, because initially there was some, that's where the overlap was. People were like, should we get involved with tracing or should we get involved with census? So talk about the community now, because you're also a maintainer of the project, adoption of the project, and how is what is the state of the project today?
So the project's doing really, really well, actually. I think to give people a little bit of a recap, yeah. So first there was a project called Open Tracing, there's a project called Open Census, and there was a lot of confusion, I think, mostly from open source maintainers that weren't sure, which should I use? I want to provide this, I want to integrate with this in my open source library, even something like Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes wanted to add distributed tracing, but there were these two sort of competing ways to do it. And they didn't want to pick a winner or a loser necessarily. So I think that was the impetus for both projects to say, look, we are truly better together. Let's stop wasting time, on these two separate visions when we can really do something that benefits everyone by working together on this project. So it's been about not quite 3 years yet since everything got kicked off with it. And we've released a final version of OpenTelemetry tracing in several languages. Later this year, we'll be releasing a 1.0 version of OpenTelemetry metrics in several languages. And we're also starting to tackle new things like adding support for structured logging and log ingestion, and then turning that into a common format called OpenTelemetry protocol. And then the future is kind of wherever we go from there, right? There's other forms of telemetry. There's other sources and sinks for it. The goal really is after, not today, not tomorrow, but maybe over the next 5 years, I would certainly love to see a world where, everything you're using just has OpenTelemetry built in, right? So you're using your web server has OpenTelemetry, your HTTP framework has OpenTelemetry, your RPC framework has OpenTelemetry, maybe your routers or your, cloud provider or, everything just has OpenTelemetry built in as a native feature of that library or framework or language. And all you have to do is, check a box or turn on a config flag and tell it where to send that data. That, I think, is going to unlock a lot of possibilities, because the challenge to get this sort of observability in the first place has always been, I think, once you've gotten that buy-in for those cultural changes and you've got the people that can work on it, now you have to approach like, well, how do I add all this instrumentation and how do I actually get that data? We want to make that data a built-in feature of the cloud native ecosystem. And we're certainly on the path.
So Lightstep is organizing a conference, Deserted Island DevOps conference. I want to know a little bit more about the conference, the history, the focus, the goal, and why you decide to host it within Animal Crossing.
So that's a fun story. Lightstep is technically the primary sponsor. We really treat this as a community event for DevOps practitioners. There are a lot of other great sponsors that have come together to make this possible. The origin story, though, is very much that it was an April Fool. I wouldn't say it was an April Fool's joke, but I announced this last year on April 1st because I thought, if it goes over like a sack of bricks, then we can always just say, April Fools. But the impetus was mostly that at the start of the pandemic, when COVID-19 was causing event cancellations and everyone was sort of, stuck inside, there was also Animal Crossing New Horizons had come out on the Switch, and it was sweeping the nation, right? It was an instant hit. Everyone felt like they were trapped inside, but here's this kind of calm, pleasant game where you go around and you shake trees for fruit. So it's actually seemed like a natural fit when you think about it, because a lot of DevOps and a lot of, being a technologist in general, right, is solving challenges in a constrained space. So part of the inspiration was, well, what if you picked a environment for a virtual event that wasn't really well suited for it, right? So Animal Crossing kind of fits that because you have a lot of constraints. There's not a ton you can do in there. It kind of puts everything into this very neat little box, and you can't color outside of it. But those constraints, I think, breed creativity. And so the challenge to our speakers was, hey, you've got this constrained environment, come up with something creative, come up with something that's informative, that's fun, that's kind of uplifting and positive, even though the world seems very dark right now. So the reception to it once we had it last year was fantastic. We had, about 14,000 people, I want to say, watched the event at some point between sort of live or on demand. And a lot of people, when you ask them over the years, like, what was your favorite virtual event of 2020? People kept saying Deserted Island DevOps. So with that in mind, it was kind of a no-brainer to bring it back again and see if we can make it go 2 for 2 on this. And I think I'd like to say we've done it. We'll see Friday.
What are going to be some of the common themes for this event?
Yeah. So there's really 3 common themes that we're talking about. One is, of course, DevOps, and more specifically, DevOps culture, right? We have a pretty broad range of speakers, people from the industry, people from academia, individual practitioners that have sort of led, DevOps teams or have implemented DevOps practices in their organization. And a lot of those talks are really about, how'd you do it, right? Our keynote is actually a fantastic talk from Chloe Condon, who's at Microsoft, about DevOpsing your world, right? And it's the lessons, it's kind of her personal story of how she got into all this and how those lessons from DevOps both help her personal growth and some of the things she's done in her personal life, but also the things she did before, how those are kind of also part of DevOps, right? And showing this commonality between things. The second big group of talks we have is about resiliency. And I think that's both resiliency in terms of, working remotely, running effective teams, but also personal resiliency, right? It's been a very hard year for a lot of people, both between COVID, between, literally everything else. I mean, if I started listing off every problem that's happened, I would probably be here for an hour. But that sort of personal resiliency and how people can, not only survive, but also grow in that environment. And so we have a lot of speakers that are talking about that, things that they've done to kind of keep their teams together and keep their workplace going during the pandemic. And finally, we have several talks that are more focused on the technology, right? The next generation of DevOps tools and ideas. A lot of those are actually focusing on observability. We have a really neat case study from someone that's at a healthcare organization talking about how they're piloting distributed tracing. We've got a few more talks on those lines, and also a really good one on third-party tooling and sort of the risks and benefits of that. So I think there really is a little bit of something for everyone. We try to keep this, one of the goals of this is not to turn it into this big, long, multi-day or multi-track experience. It's 13 talks. It's about 7 hours. something that the talks are 15, 20 minutes in length. So something that, regardless of where you're at in kind of your DevOps journey, in terms of your skill level, in terms of your interests, you can tune in, watch it for an hour or two, and hopefully get some really cool lessons out of it that you can start using immediately.
Austin, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about not only the kind of very high level but very comprehensive picture of observability, but also the upcoming event. And I look forward to talk to you again. So thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be here, and I hope I see everyone this Friday for Deserted Island DevOps.